Hey. Hi, my name is Abby Kuntzleman. I'm a lab tech in Dr. Stephen Techtmann's lab at Michigan Technological University. And the work I'm about to talk about is the work that we did for the early preterm labor prediction, which is task 2. So all of this work was in collaboration with Isaac Bigcraft, who is a PhD candidate at Dr. Techtmann's lab. So about 10% of infants are born premature, and I have before 36 weeks here, but it should be before 37, so apologies for that. And then about 2% are born early preterm, which is defined as before 32 weeks of gestational age. And this graph from LaRoque et al. 2003 shows on the x-axis is gestational age, and then the y-axis is percentage survival. So before 23 weeks, there's a really low chance of survival, but once the gestational age reaches 32 weeks, the percentage survival goes almost to 100%. So before 32 weeks, there's a pretty significant risk for infants born in this time. And it's important to try to figure out what's happening here and how we can help figure out the risks for early preterm labor, especially because preterm birth rate has been rising in the US for the past couple of years. So this challenge involved 3,600 vaginal microbiome samples from about 1,300 different individuals. The data were imbalanced, so there are about twice as many individuals that delivered term as delivered preterm. And then the other presentations have talked about this a little bit, but all of the data available to us were diversity metrics about the microbiome, community state types, metadata about the patients such as race and age, and then reads and relative abundances organized by different phylogenetic cutoffs, as well as pairwise distances between the different phylotypes. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about what we did for task 1, because this is where we put the majority of our effort, and again, before 37 weeks. So what we wanted to do was see if we could create a method, or not create, but use a method that generates more data, because in general, more data makes a more accurate model. And that's especially a problem with microbiome samples, is that there's generally not enough data. So we used a generative adversarial network, or GAN, to see if we could generate more samples and then train our models on these samples. And the way a GAN works is that you have a generator network, which takes in real samples and generates fake samples that look like those real samples. And then a discriminator network, which takes in the generated fake samples as well as real samples, and then decides if the fake samples pass as real samples. And then based on what the discriminator decides, the generator can fine-tune its approach to continue making samples that look more and more like the real samples. So of course, this is a great approach for introducing more data. And it's also possible that it could introduce variants that you might not see in your training data of real samples, but you might see in testing data. But of course, these models or these samples are not biologically accurate. So it might make a more accurate model, but you might not be able to say a whole lot about these samples biologically. So Isaac got to work, he set up the GAN and generated, we focused on just relative abundance data organized by phylotypes with a cutoff of 0.1. We generated 5,000 preterm samples and 5,000 term samples. And then we have some ordination plots which show how similar the generated data was to the real data. So this is a TSNE plot. In the green and red are preterm and term generated samples, and then blue and orange are preterm and term real samples. So you can see that the generated data did make its own cluster. So it's kind of similar to the real data, but it does make its own cluster. And one idea about this is that the GAN never produced relative abundance values of 0 exactly. It produced values very close to 0, but never exactly 0. So it could be that the TSNE plot is picking up that similarity between the generated samples. And then we also have an MDS and PCA plots, which again show that the generated data is close to the real data, but there are definitely some obvious trends that we can see that's not seen in the real data. So we trained 2 models on these generated data, and then only 1 model on real samples. Model 1 was a random forest, and then model 2 is a support vector machine. And then for our 3rd model, we had seen and kind of tinkering around with the data beforehand that some other metrics outside of just the relative abundances were important for the model's decision making, such as the diversity metrics, race and collect week, and then community state type. So we included that as well. We took a very bare bones approach to this. We just used default scikit-learn hyperparameters, and we did not do any feature selection. So to test these models, for models 1 and 2, we just trained them on generated data and then tested them on the real data. And then for model 3, we did a 5-fold cross-validation, 80% training data, 20% testing data. And model 3 outperformed models 1 and 2 in all the different areas. So there's the area under the ROC curve and the PRC curve, and then accuracy. And for all of these categories, the model trained on real data outperformed the models trained on generated data. And we have two ideas about this. One is that the metadata has a greater impact on model decision than each of the individual phylotypes. And then also we could improve the GAN to make sure that it's generating samples that look more like the real samples that we had available to us. So now I'll go into what we did for task 2, which was early preterm birth prediction, defined as before 32 weeks of gestational age. Oops. Okay. We actually only ran one basic random forest classifier, so that means no hyperparameter tuning or feature selection, trained on just the real samples. And the data we used was very similar to the data used for model 3 of task 1, which is just the relative abundances, diversity metrics, race and collect week, and then community state types. And we did a 5-fold cross-validation to see how our model did on our own. And we got an ROC measure of 0.57 and a PRC of 0.45, and then accuracy was 0.92. But when the DREAM challengers went to test it on the validation data set, the accuracy and the PRC measures are the exact same, but the ROC measure was actually higher than what we had when we did our 5-fold cross-validation. So it could be, our ROCs tend to be a little more sensitive to imbalances, so it could be that the validation data set was more imbalanced than the training set. But we were also thinking that it's possible that our model was not too overtuned to the training data, so it was able to generalize a little bit better to an outside data set. And then we looked at the top 200 most important features that went into the model's decision making. Diversity metrics and collect week were the top features for that, and then of the next 192 or so features, there were 3 different races and 5 different community state types that showed up as being very important for the model's decision making. So as has been mentioned before, greater vaginal microbiome diversity is linked with preterm birth. So we were expecting to see the same thing here. We were expecting to see that early preterm samples were linked with more diverse microbiome. So these are box plots of, in blue is post 32 weeks and orange is early preterm, and then the x-axis is just all the different diversity metrics. And what we actually found was that for each of those, there was no significant difference between early preterm and post 32 weeks, which is kind of interesting because these were the most important features that the model used to make its decision. So each of the diversity metrics on their own are not really good predictors of early preterm birth. We also knew that there was a previous correlation between Black and African American people and preterm birth, so we expected to see the same thing here. But what we actually found was that for white and Black or African American, there was no significant difference. But being Asian was very strongly correlated with early preterm birth. So this was a bit of a surprise because previous studies have shown that being Asian is correlated with less risk of preterm birth. And then these are the 5 community state types that showed up in the top 200 features. Only 2 of them were significant. So community state type 5 was associated with post 32-week birth, and then community state type 3B was associated with early preterm birth, but the other community state types were not, did not show any significant difference between post 32-week and early preterm birth. And then here I have the top 5 phylotypes and their average values. So Prevotilla bivia and Ureaplasma ureolyticum were both strongly correlated with early preterm birth, while Lactobacillus jensenii and Lactobacillus crispatus were more correlated with post 32-week birth. And Lactobacillus crispatus is very close to the p-value cutoff, but I included it anyway because it is very close. And in kind of looking at the literature, it does look like Lactobacillus is associated with a colonization of the vaginal microbiome for term births. So this was kind of expected. So overall, we found that the microbiome can be used to predict preterm birth and then to a lesser extent early preterm birth. But each single feature does not actually predict early preterm birth on its own, and rather the model is picking up some complex relationship between each of the features that is not easily detectable by traditional statistical methods. And of course, I think we need to do more work to make a more accurate early preterm birth model because the accuracy was good, but the precision recall curve could be improved. So what we were thinking is that we could train on only early preterm versus term samples instead of early preterm versus post 32-week samples. And then of course we can continue refining the GAN to make it produce data that is more similar to the real data. and also apply this method to early preterm birth prediction as well. So thank you so much to the DREAM Challenge organizers, especially for having us here. I'm super excited to be in Las Vegas. It's a lot of fun to be here. And then of course to Isaac Bigcraft for his work with the GAN, and then Dr. Stephen Techtman, who advised both of us on this project. Does anyone have any questions?
So you mentioned for the better GAN models for the future work. So what that cause the bias of your model, because now your GAN is generating data set which is kind of pretty close to what you have. And that will cause the bias of your model to a specific part, and that can affect the generalization of your model. So how do you solve it?
Okay, so the question was, if you make more data that look more like the real samples, then you'll be more biased toward the data set that you're training on. Is that right?
Yes.
And then how would we deal with that in the future? There have been some methods that actually take data from a different data set and then sort of transform it to look like the data set that you're working with. So that might introduce some variance. And then if you want to come find us afterwards, Isaac did a lot of the work with the GAN. He's over there, so you can come find us and talk to us about that later. And we'd love to talk about that and hear your ideas. Thank you.
So thanks a lot for the great talk. We have two questions. One, of course, is related to the GAN, because GANs are known to have problems with mode collapsing, that you will get a solution which is more close to the mean. That is what you are also observing, that your data are moving data away from the real data. The second question is basically related to, you see something very interesting, which is like a simple random forest model is the one which is winning. So do you think that it can be converted into a monograph, which basically that you can now convert it into a rule-based system, which can be used by the clinician to basically see whether you have preterm problems or not. So we basically convert it into an experimental model, much more experimental model that can be easily used by clinician.
So are you asking if it can, repeat it again.
Yeah, if it can be converted, this random forest model that you have, can it be converted or not?
Converted into?
A simple, like kind of an explainable model, which a clinician can use.
Oh, I see.
Something that would be interesting or not for you, for example, because ultimately you need to have it in the clinic, like whatever you're doing, be a predictive model, but it has to in the end go to the clinic, such that they can use it to say that there's possibility of preterm birth or not.
Yeah, so
Can it be done or not?
So you're asking if we can better explain the random forest model that we used? Yeah, so I think looking at some of the features that the model reported as being important for its decision-making is one way that you could explain how it's working. Yeah, and I'm actually not super familiar with the theory behind random forest models, so.
Basically, you can just look at the tree and the tree branches,
Yeah.
the rules which you have to follow, basically.
Yeah.
Say that this is what will lead to a preterm birth versus not a preterm.
Mhm.
That is what you have to open the random.
Yeah, so you could look into how the random forest is making its decision to have a better explanation. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we have one online question, and normally I would say, it's offline, but since this person's online, we can't talk to you, we'll ask it now. So, the person asks, AURC, an internal test data is low, but the model performed well on validation data with high accuracy. So, the noise for the variance introduced by the GAN help, and in general,
Yeah, so I think it's definitely possible that some of the variants introduced by the GAN helped, but I think some of the questions earlier indicated that actually brings things closer to the mean. And actually for early preterm birth prediction, we did not use the GAN. So the ROC being higher for the validation data set, we did not use the GAN for that part. So that had no impact on early preterm birth prediction.